Welcome to all our friends that are joining us for this evening. Our wish is that you showing up this evening will expand and open your heart with your intention to be present to what it is that needs to come into consciousness today on this Earth Day. And thank you, Makgati, for honoring the Dark Goddess, calling her to bless this conversation and for us to get our guidance from that place, because that is indeed where this conversation has to start. It has to start with what Joanna Macy has called the great unraveling. The great unraveling. So that place where the unraveling, where the disintegration, where the death of what has to go, where we can hold hospice, hold space for that process, and where at the same time we can be the receptacles for what has to come, what has to be birthed and has to be lived in a different way for ourselves and in relationship with each other and in relationship with the living systems of which we are interdependent. That was a beautiful invocation. Thank you. So we thought we would just touch on Earth Day, just say a few words, just for a few minutes. It's very poignant for me, this idea of Earth Day, because it is really what is referred to as the start of the modern environmental movement, the sort of modern day environmental movement. Really in 1969, and then the first sort of official Earth Day in 1970, which is now 51 years ago. And that is almost sort of, I'm a bit older than that, but it's almost my entire sort of lifespan. And it's very poignant to think that if we had been able to act on the knowledge that we had at that time already in 1969, in 1970, when many of the first projections were being made around the carrying capacity of Earth, the gas house emissions, the warming of Earth. We have had all this information. We've had it for the last 50 years. And we have allowed ourselves to come to the absolute edge of the precipice, the absolute edge of the precipice. So it's interesting that it started in the US, them being now the greatest emitter, I think, between the US and China. So there's a big theme of environmental justice that we won't have time to go into tonight. But it's a big aspect of this conversation. And it was only in 1990 that it really became an international phenomenon. And then in 2009, not that long ago, it was ratified by the UN. And the significant thing really was in 2016, which is now really not that long ago. On this day, the Paris agreements were entered into by all the nations of the world, by many of the nations in the world, which set this target of 1.5 degrees Celsius, beyond which the Earth cannot warm without absolutely catastrophic results for all the Earth systems. The thing that I kind of like about the concept of Earth Day is that it was originally conceptualized by a peace activist that came out of all the civil rights movements, out of the anti-Vietnam, the anti-war movements. And it's almost as if right at the beginning of this movement, there was an understanding that this is an intersection of all of these different themes of justice, of oppression, of harm that we humans do to each other, and that we can't. Some of you might remember Makgati and I from our racism conversations. We can't divorce our racism conversations from the conversation that we're having this evening about the state that we have found ourselves in with regards to the planet. And the other thing that I like about the original conception of Earth Day was that it was originally proposed to do what in America they call a teach-in. And so this idea of really arming ourselves with knowledge and with really, making sure that we have the knowledge that we need was there right from the beginning. And it's something really to ponder how in these 51 years that have gone by since that Earth Day, 22nd of April, 1970, how many of us on planet Earth have continued with a kind of living in a kind of a state of denial and in a state of disconnect and dissonance, cognitive dissonance from the realities that were confronting us. So it's a significant day today. It's estimated that more than 1 billion people on planet Earth is marking Earth Day in some way, with some ritual, with some activism, with some ceremonies. And it's just personally for me, it is so heartwarming. And I'm so grateful to all of you, grateful to Cindy and Mark and Josh, grateful to Makgati and everybody who's participating, that this is also a space that I may participate in this evening to mark Earth Day and to be part of that human community. So I'm hoping that the participants on this call also might be feeling that. Yeah, so Makgati, did you want to come in there before I dive into just a little bit of the horror story? We thought it would not be true. This conversation would not be true if we didn't just drop into the conversation some of the horrors that we are actually facing. We don't want to overdo it. We're not scientists. We don't have the time, really, but we thought we would share a few bits of data points. But before we go there, Makgati, did you want to?
Yeah, I want to. I would like to speak a little bit into why we are doing it like this, and thank you for walking this journey with all of us here. Thank you, everybody that is here. Whew, it is much, much bigger than I myself realize. What we are doing, what we have done, what we continue to do is much, much bigger than any of us, I think, realizes. And it really is a crisis of the spirit. And this is why we wanted to bring this conversation here, is because what we are experiencing now, how we have made allowance for the conditions that our planet is experiencing, is exactly what we have allowed to take place inside of us internally. And so it is a crisis of the spirit, precisely because we ourselves have disconnected. Firstly, from even recognizing our essential nature as divinity. We've disconnected from that. And once we disconnect from that, then we have sought to find identity outside of ourselves. Because when we experience that disconnection, it does lead to some psychic, a psychic wounding, a psychic yearning, a soul yearning. And in seeking for our source, we have looked outside of ourselves instead of inside of ourselves. And so it makes sense. It is not heartwarming, it is not life-giving sense, but it makes sense, therefore, that we have created divisions between ourselves, precisely with reference to our conversation, Ilse, that we have created divisions between ourselves and have become quite avaricious in trying to feed our yearning soul, our hungry soul. And in creating these divisions and being avaricious, we have then gone into the earth and extracted from her. And we've extracted from one another. And we've extracted and stolen from the First Nations, the keepers of memory those that knew how to care for Mother Earth, those who knew how to take enough and not everything. Take just what I need and leave the rest so that Mother Earth can regenerate herself so that we can be fed in turn. What we have done, however, is to continue to extract and extract. But this extraction really speaks of a deep hunger that we do not even have a name for. And so when we start looking within ourselves and we start re-nourishing Mother Earth, when we see ourselves as part of nature, because we've forgotten that. We think that we, Homo sapiens, are superior above nature, that we think that we are thinking, we think that we are wiser, we are more intelligent, and we have sovereignty over everything else. We behave as if we do, and yet we may easily be the most stupid of them all, the most unwise, the most dangerous of all. And so that our relationship to all there is that is within, that is on earth, if we heal our relationship, perhaps we can recognize that we do not need to kill this very whole that we are living on. So the spiritual crisis is absolutely mimicked in our relationship to Mother Earth. Yeah, that's.
Oh, thank you for that. And I think that is why we thought that there isn't really anybody for whom this is not a critical question. You know, what is Earth Day to you? What is it to you? Why do you need to bother to show up to this conversation? I mean, surely there's some things you can just leave to those greenies, or you can just, leave it to those hippies, or you can, leave it to those muesli eating, those weird types, or leave it maybe to, Greta Thunberg, or, but what is it really to me? And we're hoping that question is a question that we will really all continue to take away with us this evening in a very, very serious way. That would not be a rhetorical question, but that would become a life question. That would become a life question for all of us, because it is an indivisible whole, our own incarnation. We are made of the same elements. We are made of, we are a living system embedded and nested in living systems. And this question is possibly the most important question that we can possibly ask in this incarnation of ours at this time. And we have to believe that we were incarnated at this time for a particular reason. And what might that be? So Makgati was saying about extraction and about that sense of extraction and almost that predatory sense of extraction, and it leads us into just one or two of those data points that I was referring to. And the first one I want to share is this idea of overshoot day. And I don't know, Cindy, if you've come across it, or if any of our participants, maybe some of our participants have come across it, but there's this thing called overshoot day. And it is the day in the year when our demand for ecological services and ecological resources exceed what Earth can regenerate in that particular year cycle. And so the overshoot day in 2019 globally was on the 29th of July in 2019. That was the day on which we would go into debt. We would be extracting more than what Earth can regenerate. So we would need more Earths to continue to live the way we're living. So because of lockdown and COVID, there was a slight adjustment in 2020, and it moved back to early August, which is an interesting little sign that this is possible. It is possible for us to shift these, to shift. It's not, this is a critical moment that we are in right now. It is still possible for us to shift some of the consequences of these Earth systems. However, different countries find themselves on different places on that annual calendar of Overshoot Day. And it's quite sobering to know that in South Africa, our Overshoot Day for 2021 is predicted to be the 4th of July. In 2019, our Overshoot Day was the 8th of July. I'm not sure of the 2020 figures. So on the 4th of July, we in South Africa are anticipated to go into overshoot. But then we also have to put that in context, because that's not all 50 million South Africans, because we know how stratified our society is. And we know that the top sort of 2, 3, 4, 5% of the South African population consume the absolute overwhelming amount of resources in our own country. So that means there is really a small percentage of people in South Africa, the wealthy, the elites, the ones with the really heavy ecological footprints, that are responsible for that overshoot. However, we know that the consequences and the hardship and the suffering of the consequences of climate change and global warming fall to the poor, fall to the vulnerable. And so there is this inequality and injustice that's built into this whole phenomena. Such an important thing for us to show up to. But to also put it a little bit into perspective, Joanna Macy, in her book Active Hope, does this little kind of infographic, which I think is just so interesting for us, just to get a little bit of perspective. I just want to share these two images with all of you. So what she invites us to do is to say that if you want to think about our planet, the history of our planet, which is 4.5 billion years. So if you want to imagine that as a single day, so the 4.5 billion years of our planet's history is a single day, then humans only appear 5 seconds before midnight. 5 seconds before midnight, humans appear. We are on an ancient living organism. We arrived 5 seconds ago. And yet, if we take those 5 seconds, it becomes 240,000 years of human history. 240,000 years of human history. And if we make that into a day, then in the last 20 seconds of that day of human history, we have consumed more resources than in all of the previous history of human history on planet Earth. In the last 20 seconds of that day representing our entire human history on planet Earth. And so this has led us to what is referred to as the sixth mass extinction. And it's an ecological emergency, and it's been confirmed now by more than, it's an indisputable fact that we are in this ecological emergency. And it involves all our Earth systems. And it involves Earth systems in an amplifying set of feedback loops with various tipping points. And what the scientists tell us is that we have to face the fact that they refer to it as untold suffering that will be following in the wake of the unfolding of this unraveling of our Earth systems. So our biggest challenge is to keep our gas emissions to 1.5 degrees Celsius. That's our biggest challenge as a planet. But there are two problems with that, and I'm almost done with the stats. There are two problems with that. The one problem is that South Africa is what's considered a hotspot internationally, a climate hotspot. So that means that we are warming at twice the rate than the rest of the planet. So even if the rest of the planet, so there's some climate hotspots across the planet, and even if the rest of the planet manages to keep global warming to 1.5 degrees, which, by the way, there is almost zero chance of that happening at this point, almost zero chance within the timeframes we have. Even then, South Africa will be warming double that. So it'll be a 3-degree warming. And what that means for our food systems and for our water scarcity and for climate refugees within sort of Southern Africa and within the African continent is really at this point, at this point not possible for us really to imagine the full scope of the consequences of this. And the other aspect that one just also has to mention is that, and it's important to say this, I think it's so important for us to confront this truth, is that there is the phenomenon of what is called baked in gashouse emissions, baked in, which means that these emissions have already been released. They're already in the system, they've already been released, but they haven't quite yet come to the full kind of consequences of their unfolding. And the way I like to describe that is it's almost like when you're in the shower and the water is too hot or too cold and you want to adjust the tap, and you adjust the tap so that the tap is adjusted. It's the hot is much, you've turned it on much, opened it far further, but you're not yet feeling that hot water. You know that phenomenon? It's still quite cold. And then suddenly that hot water pours out of the shower. That's the kind of phenomenon that we're talking about. So there's the amount of gas emissions that's already baked in means that we have what is referred to as a carbon budget, a very, very small carbon budget that we have to use before we will exceed the 1.5 degree global warming. And in the latest report by the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, which is a very mainstream, very conservative, these are not crazies. We're not talking about crazies. This is very conservative UN structures, warned us that it is likely that before 2030, in the next 3 to 5 to 8 years, we would have exhausted what's left of our carbon budget. So I don't know if you and our friends listening, maybe many of you are very familiar with all this data, but there is a kind of a cognitive dissonance between how serious this is, how urgent this is, and the kind of business as usual complete denial that not just world leaders are sort of choosing, but also each of us who live our comfortable middle class lives. For those of us, speaking for myself, I still use toothpaste tubes. My recycling is a bit shoddy. I still drive my car without really considering and so on and so on. Of course, I am attempting to hold at a spiritual and at a sort of a life level. I am trying to show up to these issues, but there is just this weird dissonance between how serious things are and how it seems to how so many of us still seem to continue to live our lives very much in a kind of in a delusion of some sort, which is maybe why we do need that dark goddess.
Mm.
So those were just.
Gosh, Ilse. Sure, it's time to wake up. It's time to wake up. Our slumber, our comfortable slumber. Sure, we will be burning. The fire will find us in our beds, and we will be burned to ashes. And we will not.
And the question is, of course, how does one move through the shock, the denial, the terror, the panic that all of this can engender? And for myself, when I started immersing myself in the climate movement a couple of years ago, it took me months. It took me months to just work through. And I haven't, of course, done that. It's not possible to do that, but to begin to process the grief, what's called climate grief. There's a whole climate trauma. There's a whole lot of research being done now about what is happening to us around global warming. It is considered the number one public health risk, global warming, climate change. And a large part of that is got to do with issues around mental wellness. Because, of course, if you start thinking about the losses, if you start thinking about the fact that this is an immediate reality that our children face. So many of us with children have to work through what that means. Each of us has a path, as a journey that we have to walk through that shock and that pain. But the important thing, of course, is that we do walk through it, that we do process it, and that we do come to a place where we are personally processing these issues and transforming, and where we can step into what Joanne Macy refers to as active hope. Not just hope that somebody is going to sort it out somewhere, but active, embodied hope, where we can begin to be that change that Cindy was talking about. Yeah, so Makgati, do you want to share with us some of your own responses to this and some of your own commitments that you've made and the path that you've chosen in relation to this?
I mean, it's the active hope is so important, and I'm thinking of when I first learned of HIV and going through that grief. And when we all entered into this the pandemic now, and that grief that gripped me was intense. And And the climate, what's happening with our earth, our home, is also gripping me. And it is so important not to be debilitated by this, but to be woken up so that my mature self can respond in a manner that is skillful, to steal a Buddhist term, and skillful in serving all of us, not just me, because that's where our initial issue has started, is saving myself and disconnecting from even recognizing or even having empathy for the needs of the other. And so I think that when we start creating, healing our relationships with one another, we may start recognizing that there is enough for all of us, and not one of us needs um, to grab on and hang on to everything. We can afford to open our hands and allow the energy to flow in and out, the resources to flow in and out, and trust that what is needed is what will land, and whatever is not needed will go and serve somebody else. My own journey, I mean, I grew up, as you know, I grew up with a mother who was a traditional healer and a herbalist chemist, in the African manner. And I remember my mother. One time we were walking in McGregor, so it was the first time in the Cape, and we were walking in the veld, and she came across some plants, and she said, "Oh, I don't know this plant. I don't know what this is. It's so interesting." And she went to the plant bush, and she touched the bush, and she stopped, and she put her ear to the bush, and she closed her eyes, and I said, "Mama, what are you doing?" And she said, "I am listening to it so that it may tell me what its uses are." Now, that kind of relationship to the earth and to the medicine that she provides, because she provides. Even though we may stop recognizing what she provides, she continues to provide. And I think in that, well, way before, but certainly in that moment, because I experienced her doing this as an adult, I think unconsciously it deposited something inside of me about my own relationship to this living system that we call Mother Earth. And it taught me to pay attention to the cycles of nature. What I do, how I live my life is, and not even intentionally in honoring of Mother Earth, but the work that I do and the work that makes me feel alive and expanded is my work in assisting people connect with their own cycles as a rites of passage companion. And it is recognizing that all of us, pretty much like Mother Nature, because we are her children, we all have our internal rhythms and our natural cycles that are also held within our communities. That perhaps when our communities, when our tribes are awake enough, they help take us through these rites of passage so that we live awake and we recognize that there is this step and there is this next phase, and that there's a passage that assists me to move from this to the next passage. And so in my own work, that's what I do, is to assist people to move to the next phases in their lives, to transition from one phase to the other. And I rely on the resources that Mother Nature gives. I use fire in my work. And of course, we know that without fire, none of us would be here. And so I use fire in a way that reminds me that this is a powerful healing gift that we've been gifted. And it is fire that can destroy that which no longer works, no longer is useful, but it's also fire that is regenerative. And so what in us needs to be destroyed? So in other words, as I am on this phase now, as I transition, what do I need to leave behind? And how can I call on fire to release me of that which I need to leave behind? What is this journey that I take? And what do I land in? And how can fire then assist me in regenerating and giving life to something new in myself? So that's part of my work. And in my own personal, how can I divorce my work from my personal? But in the way that that Mother Nature has claimed me. Last year, I kept saying to people, I feel like Mother Nature is claiming me. I feel like she is claiming me. And what I did at the end of the year was to host a 21-day solo retreat for myself. And in that retreat, solo silent retreat, and during that retreat, I step on the balcony and in the middle of the night, and I speak to the universe, I speak to the dark skies, and I say, guide me so that the life that I live in is one of significance. Guide every aspect of how I should live my life. Tell me how I should live my life. And there was a clear response that one of them that said, Makati, you consuming animal products is at variance, it's in disharmony to the spiritual life, the spiritual path you are yearning for. So think about it. It was a choice. This is done without judgment, but think about it. What do you want? If you want to progress in your spirituality, know that for you, consuming animals is inhibiting that growth. And so, of course, then with that came, okay, finally, I woke up very much like a lot of people what are the substances that I use in my own home? How can I use substances that are more nourishing of the earth rather than creating more making larger the ozone layer. And so at a personal level, those are some of the activities, but also it's about how do I live my life with the other? How quickly do I jump into judgment? How quickly do I create those boundaries? Because I know actually those for me are the very things that will disconnect me from Mother Earth. When I'm disconnected from my sisters, from my brothers, then I'm connected from my mother. How can I be connected to her? I connect to her by connecting to one another. It's a journey. Of course, I too am using toothpaste out of tubes, and I drink bottled water. I drink, lots of opportunities for change are available. And you, Ilse?
Sure, I was thank you for sharing that with us, and I've been able to witness your path with veganism and with growing your own vegetables, and it's been very inspiring for me as well. I have one vegan child and one vegetarian child, and a husband who still comes from the good old days of the braai. And so, as a family, we really are in a transitional space with food. Sometimes we've got cow's milk, soya milk, almond milk, and coconut milk. Sort of like, you kind of don't know where you're going with all of this. But the thing that really was really sort of that touched me really was this invocation of fire. And it makes me think about this fires that we've just had at the University of Cape Town, that we've had on the slopes of Table Mountain. And I remember in the early days of me coming to terms with how serious this all was, walking on the Zandvlei here in Muizenberg, where I live, and just weeping and weeping and weeping and thinking about bizarre things, thinking about all the poetry anthologies, thinking about silly old William Shakespeare. Why him? Thinking about, the ancient tapestries, thinking just about artifacts, cultural artifacts, and just all the beauty that we've also produced as humanity, and knowing that many of these things will be lost. Many of these things will be lost. I mean, even this supposedly impenetrable seed bank that they built in somewhere in Scandinavia on the Svalbard kind of island, which was supposed to house all the seeds for the survival of humanity, has been affected by global warming, and the ice has melted, and this supposedly safest place on planet Earth has been damaged already by the effects of the melting of so much of the ice. And so I remember walking on the Vlei. The southeaster was probably howling, and me weeping, and it was so interesting, because when I heard that the library had burnt down, and that these irreplaceable cultural artifacts, particularly the African Studies Library and the African Studies Film Archive, and that all of these things are gone. And I've got some friends and colleagues and comrades some of whose material were part of those archives. It was my heart, it's so tender. It's almost not possible to talk about that loss. And at the same time, something in me recognized that I had been there a couple of years ago, walking on the Vlei, kind of weeping, beginning to kind of work with this loss, this idea of loss. So I think that is, for me, that is a really big piece of work that we need to do, is that there is a certain degree of inevitability around things that we will lose and that we have to lose. Some of it is our lifestyles, some of it is our hopes and aspirations for how things might have been, and some of it are material things, and some of these things are irreplaceable. And we're not even talking about a human life. We are talking about things, but those things are imbued with so much meaning and with so much power. So what was extremely helpful for me was coming across the work of Joanna Macy and what she calls her eco-sattva vows. And I took those vows a couple of years ago, and they've been a container for me within which I can experience this grief, and I can make my choices and sort of live my life. And so these vows speak very much to the inner, to the one's inner life, but they also call upon sort of action in the world. And I also wanted to mention this evening that there is some really amazing things happening in our country. And for any of the friends that might be listening and that might not be aware of it, there's been an incredible grouping of civil society members that have come together over the last 2-3 years, maybe even longer. The consultative processes have been going on, and finally launched last year in October the South African Climate Justice Charter. And if you're feeling a bit overwhelmed by this conversation this evening, if you don't know which way to turn, other than your own inner work, or to make sense of really what it is that we're dealing with, I really encourage people to Google the South African Climate Justice Charter. It is such an amazing imagination. The document contains an imagination for the future, how it can be, how things can be. And it's a radical document. It's a revolutionary document because it looks at all of these different interlocking systems. It recognizes how racism and capitalism and patriarchy, all of these big words, are all interwoven with the climate crisis that we are facing. And so there's something very strengthening about this idea of solidarity, of being with like-minded, being with brothers and sisters who are willing to work with the grief, but to also rise to the challenge of imagining how things can be different. And for me, it's very much, as it is for you, Makgati, it's very much a combination of the inner work and then the outer work, the inner work and the outer work. And for me, following and giving my support to the Climate Justice Charter is a large part of my sort of outer work, but also a commitment to raise this issue in whatever forum I can find myself. So part of the Eco-Sattva vows is that I will every day find an opportunity to raise these issues and to kind of bring them into conversation and into consciousness wherever I find myself. So I don't know, the vows, there are 5 of them. They're not very long. Would you be interested in hearing them?
Absolutely, yes, please.
And you can also Google them, the Eco-Sattva vows, Joanna Macy, and you don't need to go through a big Buddhist retreat. You don't have to be Buddhist. You don't need to be an environmental activist to create your own ritual if these vows speak to you. So they go as follows. I vow to myself and to each of you to commit myself daily to the healing of our world and the welfare of all beings. Secondly, to live on earth more lightly and less violently in the food, products, and energy I consume. Thirdly, to draw strength and guidance from the living earth, the ancestors, the future generations, and my brothers and sisters of all species. Fourthly, to support others in our work for the world and to ask for help when I need it. And finally, to pursue a daily practice that clarifies my mind, strengthens my heart, and supports me in observing these vows. And so be it.
So, yes. That was beautiful. That was really beautiful. It makes me think of it makes me think that when we have experienced all the destruction and everything has been burnt down, that perhaps we open up to the possibility that it is done for us, even as we are the main participants, that perhaps What burns down is done for us so that we can reimagine something that is far more life giving, far more us than me, and us encompassing all there is. And so, even as we watch heartbreakingly the burning of ancient artifacts, that perhaps we also say, may those who hold the memory of what was, may we step aside from our arrogance and beg them to tell us stories so that we too remember. Then we pass it on and pass it on and pass it on.
Yeah. Keep it alive. We keep it alive. We keep it alive. We keep it alive. So I see that our time is moving very close to 8 o'clock. We have a suggested little healing practice, and we have a last offering, which we thought we might share with you this evening, to connect us to everybody else on planet Earth that are observing this Earth Day. So we thought to take it just out of our own context, our own South African context and our own Pan-African context, but just to connect with everybody around planet Earth that are celebrating and honoring Earth Day today. We want to end with a little video clip that Josh will play for us. But before we do that, we thought in terms of a healing practice, we want to invite you, and maybe many of you have already done this, but we want to invite you to really find some time, maybe this evening before you go to bed, or otherwise there's a lovely long weekend ahead in South Africa, to come into some silence, to find a kind of a comfortable position, and to become aware of your breath, because it is this breath that is at peril. With the release of all the methane gases, with the release of the gas house emissions, eventually the very air that we breathe will become poisonous. And so to become very, very aware of breath, and to ask ourselves the question, what sustains us? What sustains us? What sustains me? So that's your healing practice, to get very quiet, to become very aware of your breath, and to ask yourself, your higher self, what sustains me? So that you could maybe come into the embodied realization of how it is the air, the love letters that the trees release, that we inhale, that it is the waters from the rivers and the waterways, the sacred waterways that we drink and that flow in our veins. That it's the food that grow in this very thin layer of soil. I never realized how thin the layer of fertile soil is on planet Earth, and how this is the most generative 2 feet of dark, life-giving soil. And it's from that all food is miraculously manifested. What sustains me? The air, the water, the food. And then that peace that comes from being in nature, being immersed in nature. The peace, the healing of the soul that comes from being amidst living things in their natural habitats and environments. What sustains me? And maybe if we do this practice of inquiring into what sustains me, we will come to a deeper realization, a deeper level of gratitude for this living organism. And that might be the door through which we can walk into a life where we can live with greater awareness around the time that we find ourselves in. So that is what we invite you to do sometime between now and our beloved Freedom Day on Tuesday. Makgati, some last words from you, and then we'll hand over to Cindy to play us out with our final offering.
May love be the juice, the fluid that connects us all and delivers us all into an imagined future where we take care of one another and take care of the planet.
Thank you, Makgati. Thank you for that. There's a beautiful comment in the chat, and I'm going to read it a little bit while we play our clip. Cindy, do you want to introduce the clip?
I will. Are we going to say good evening and play a good night and play out with that? I think that's a good idea, and just leave that. So before we go, I'd like to thank you both, as usual, for your time, your commitment of sharing what we hide behind. You both bring this to the forefront. You poke us, you poke the bear, you poke the Moya platform, because we want to bypass this because it's easier. So I heard some facts and figures tonight that shocked me. I don't think I'm alone. And really brought some serious thinking about the little things that we do and that what we can do. And I think creating hope within us, because that's really important, this overwhelming grief. But also, Makgati, you brought the hope and how we do that. So I thank you both very much. Ilse, if you want to read a little bit about that, then we will then start the video. And thank you all. Have a lovely long weekend and a beautiful Freedom Day. And we will see you all back in May at some point.
There's just a beautiful comment from Kay about her own work in nature conservation and about how one has to move out of the head. You have to move beyond all the facts. You need the facts, but you have to move beyond the facts really to get to a heart space with this work and the spiritual shift that's needed and the healing that often happens when you just take people into nature. So that was just a beautiful comment from Kay. So thank you very much, everybody. It was an honor to be here with you this evening. And from the future generations, from the youth, the voice of the youth, we leave you with a message from the youth. Amanda Gorman, the famous young poet laureate of the United States, a beautiful poem that she wrote about 2-3 years ago called Earthrise.